Everything you believe about the world's first murder is a lie carefully constructed over millennia, woven into sermons, art, and the very fabric of our moral understanding. We have been taught that Cain, the firstborn of humanity, was cursed by God and branded with a mark of shame, a scarlet letter for all the world to see and scorn, a mark that identified him as a fratricide, a monster to be hunted and reviled. But what if I told you that is the exact opposite of the truth? What if the most infamous symbol of sin in human history was never a punishment? Imagine if the Mark of Cain wasn't a curse at all. It was a gift, a terrifying, powerful, and divine technology of protection, a shield that made him utterly untouchable. The story we've been told is one of a cowering fugitive, forever looking over his shoulder. The truth, hidden in the very scripture we claim to know, is the story of a king, an architect of civilization, empowered by God's own decree, walking the earth not in fear, but in dreadful, inviolable power. Forget the story of the first sinner. Tonight, we uncover the story of the first survivor, armed with a secret that changes everything we thought we knew about God, humanity, and the forces that truly shape our world. The smoke of the offerings has cleared. The blood of Abel cries out from the ground, its voice an eternal echo in the ears of God. And Cain stands before the Creator, his hands stained, his soul fractured. God speaks, and the curse is delivered. This part we know. You are cursed from the earth, God says. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. A fugitive and a wanderer you shall be on the earth. This is the punishment, the barren soil, the rootless existence. This is the sentence for his crime. But then Cain responds. And in his response, the entire narrative pivots. He doesn't just accept his fate, he negotiates. He reveals a fear more profound than starvation or exile. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." This is the critical moment. Cain's fear is not of God's curse, but of man's vengeance. He knows the law of blood for blood is about to be born with him as its first target. He sees a world of men, his future brothers, cousins, nephews, all rising up to avenge Abel. He is now prey. And it is here, in response to this specific fear, that the mark is given. What does the scripture actually say? Read it, not with the filter of tradition, but with fresh eyes. Genesis chapter 4, verse 15. And the Lord said to him, "Therefore, whoever slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him." Read that again. Lest anyone finding him should kill him. The mark was not to identify him for punishment. It was to identify him for protection. It was the solution to the problem Cain had just raised. It was a divine restraining order issued against the entire human race. The curse was the wandering. The mark was the shield that allowed him to wander. We have conflated the two for thousands of years, turning an act of divine preservation into an act of divine condemnation. We were wrong. It wasn't a curse. It was divine protection. This single, deliberate misreading has blinded us to one of the deepest and most paradigm-shifting secrets of the Old Testament. The question we should have been asking all along is not what was Cain's sin, but what, in God's name, was the true nature of this mark. To understand the mark, we must discard our childish notions of a scar or a tattoo. This is not a brand of ink or fire. This is an act of God. It is a piece of metaphysical engineering, a form of divine technology beyond our comprehension. Imagine what it would take to fulfill its purpose. It had to be a universal deterrent. It had to work on anyone, anywhere, without prior knowledge of Cain or his story. A simple X on his forehead would mean nothing to a person who had never heard of him. It had to be instinctual, primal, and absolute. So what if the mark wasn't something you but saw fought, but something you felt bought? What if the Lord placed upon Cain an aura, a palpable field of pure dread? Imagine a traveler in the land of Nod, seeing a stranger in the distance. As he approaches, weapon in hand, a cold terror begins to grip his heart. His muscles lock, his breath catches in his throat. He is overcome by a wave of unnatural fear so profound, so alien, that his only instinct is to turn and flee. He doesn't know why. He doesn't understand the source of this terror. All he knows is that to approach that man is to invite a horror his soul cannot withstand. He has just encountered the Mark of Cain. It is not a sign that says killer. It is a psychic scream that says do not touch. Or, let's push the boundaries even further. The ancient world was steeped in a different understanding of reality, one where the veil between the physical and the metaphysical was thin. What if the mark was a perceptual filter, a distortion in reality itself centered on Cain? Perhaps you saw a shimmering column of heat, a figure made of burning shadow, a glitch in the fabric of the world that your mind could not process. The human brain abhors a vacuum. It recoils from that which it cannot categorize. Seeing Cain would be like looking at an impossible object, a sight so cognitively dissonant and terrifying that it would drive you mad to stare too long. This would be a perfect defense. No one could get close enough to harm him because no one could truly perceive him. He would walk through the world as a living paradox, untouchable because he was, in a very real sense, incomprehensible. But there is a third, and perhaps the most chilling possibility, one that is encoded directly into the text. The sevenfold vengeance. Whoever slays Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. We read this as a threat, a future promise from God. But what if it wasn't a promise? What if it was a law of physics? What if the mark was a piece of divine, karmic technology that automated vengeance? A quantum entanglement between Cain and the very principle of divine justice. Imagine a man, driven by rage or greed, managing to overcome the instinctual fear. He raises a club and brings it down on Cain's arm. In that exact instant, the attacker's own arm shatters in 7 places. He throws a rock at Cain, and 7 rocks materialize out of thin air and strike him down. The vengeance isn't something God does later. It is an instantaneous, automatic, and multiplicative reflection of any violence directed at Cain. The mark becomes a perfect, passive, aggressive defense system. To attack Cain is to attack yourself, magnified by the terrifying power of God's own decree. This wasn't a mark of shame. It was the most sophisticated personal security system ever conceived, a power so absolute that it would make a man not a pariah, but a figure of unimaginable awe and terror. And what does a man with such power do? Does he cower in caves? Does he wander the desert in fear? The Bible tells us exactly what he does. He builds a city. This is perhaps the most overlooked and shattering verse in the entire Cain narrative. Genesis 4, verse 17. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Stop and think about the staggering implication of this single sentence. The man, we are told, is a cursed fugitive, a hated wanderer doomed to a life of fruitless toil, goes out and performs one of the greatest acts of creation and civilization. He builds a city. How is this possible? How does a solitary outcast who everyone supposedly wants to kill convince people to follow him, to work with him, to build walls and establish a society? It makes absolutely no sense in the traditional narrative. But in our new understanding, it makes perfect sense. Cain wasn't a pariah. He was a leader whose authority was absolute because it was backed by a terrifying divine power, who would dare challenge a man who could not be harmed, who would not follow a leader protected by God's own impenetrable shield. People wouldn't have followed him out of love. They would have followed him out of awe, out of fear, out of the recognition that they were in the presence of something beyond the natural order. Cain, the builder of the first city, wasn't the first criminal. He was the first king, his crown a mark of dreadful power. His kingdom built on the foundation of his own untouchability. The curse of the ground forced him to innovate. He could not rely on simple agriculture. So his descendants, born in this new city, became the progenitors of technology and the arts. We see it laid out just a few verses later. Jabal, the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock, he pioneers nomadic pastoralism, a new way to live off the land. His brother, Jubal, is the father of all those who play the harp and flute, the birth of music and art. And then there is Tubal, Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron metallurgy, the forging of tools of weapons, the very bedrock of advanced civilization. All of it flows not from the blessed line of Seth, but from the supposedly cursed line of Cain. Why? Because the curse created the need, and the mark provided the security for this new model of humanity to develop. God did not discard Cain's lineage. He protected it. He set it apart and allowed it to flourish in a different way. It was a separate, parallel experiment in human potential, one founded on struggle, technology, and the power of the city, all made possible by the divine protection granted to its founder. This reinterpretation forces us to look at the very nature of God in a new light. The God of the Old Testament is often portrayed as a being of wrath and simplistic, punitive justice. But the story of Cain's mark reveals a being of staggering complexity. Here is a God who, in the face of the first murder, does not respond with simple annihilation. He enacts a curse that fits the crime, separation from the life, giving earth that Cain has defiled with blood. But then, he immediately balances this with an act of preservation. He preserves the life of the murderer. Why? Why protect the first killer? The apocryphal texts, the forbidden books like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, offer tantalizing clues. These texts speak of a great cosmic plan, of lineages and bloodlines playing specific roles in a drama that spans millennia. Some Gnostic traditions even went so far as to revere Cain, seeing him not as a sinner, but as an agent of a higher power, a being who possessed a spark of a greater wisdom, a gnosis that the God of the Old Testament sought to suppress. In this view, Abel represented a blind, animalistic servitude, while Cain's action, however violent, was a step towards a new consciousness. While we may not go that far, we must ask, what purpose did Cain's lineage serve? Perhaps it was to be a counterweight to the pastoral, agrarian lineage of Seth, a lineage of builders, of innovators, of those who looked not to the soil for sustenance, but to their own hands and minds. It was the birth of the city, state of technology, of a path for humanity that was not defined by the Garden of Eden, but by the forge and the hammer. God, in his infinite and often terrifying wisdom, seems to have set two paths for humanity into motion. He did not want one to be extinguished by the other. The mark was the guarantee that this new, audacious experiment in human civilization would survive its infancy. It was a divine patent, a cosmic copyright on a new way of being human. Think of it. The mark is described by the Hebrew word sartoth, which means a sign, a token, a miracle. It is the same word used for the rainbow God sets as a covenant with Noah. It is used for the signs and wonders God performs in Egypt. It is a word of power, of divine communication and action. It is never a word that inherently means shame. We have projected that meaning onto it through our own limited moral lens, failing to see the grander, more mysterious design at play. He was not a man racked with guilt and shame, cowering from the eyes of others. He was a man isolated by his own terrible power. He would walk through a crowd and see it part before him, not in recognition, but in a wave of primal fear. He could never know true companionship, for who could embrace a man wrapped in a field of dread? Who could love a man whose very presence was a violation of the natural order? His protection was his prison, a gilded cage of divine power. He was the safest man on earth, and also the most alone. This tragic, magnificent isolation would have made him a figure of myth even in his own time. A walking legend, the man who spoke with God and walked away with a piece of his terrible power. He was a living testament to the fact that divine justice is not simple, and divine mercy is often indistinguishable from a terrible and awesome power. He was the blueprint for the God, kings of later civilizations, men who ruled by divine right and inspired both terror and awe. Cain was the original, and the knowledge of this power did not die with him. It rippled down through his descendants, becoming a source of pride and, eventually, of horrific arrogance. We see this with perfect clarity in the story of Cain's great-great-grandson, Lamech. The passage in Genesis is one of the most brutal and baffling in the entire book. Lamech comes to his 2 wives and boasts, in a strange and ancient poem, Ada and Zillah, "Hear my voice, wives of Lamech, listen to my speech, for I have slain a man for wounding me, even a young man for hurting me. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 70 sevenfold." For centuries, this has been interpreted as a simple song of escalating depravity, a sign that the sin of Cain was multiplying and festering in his lineage. But with our new understanding of the mark, Lamech's boast takes on an entirely new and far more sinister meaning. He is not just confessing to a murder, he is making a claim. He is trying to usurp the power of his great ancestor. Lamech has heard the legends of the untouchable Cain. He understands that the mark was not a brand of shame, but a mantle of invulnerability. He sees